You're listening to Natural Resources University. This week's episode features Timber University, hosted by Dr. Brady Self and Dr. Sean Panger.
Welcome to Timber University, a podcast brought to you by the Mississippi State University Forestry Extension Team. I'm Sean Tanger.
And I'm Brady Self. We're both forestry specialists covering topics ranging from soils to silviculture to social sciences as they pertain to forest stewardship.
In this podcast, we'll extend research findings that are relevant to forest landowners, consultants, loggers, and other natural resource professionals.
If you fall into one of those categories, we'll help you explore historical and current science that you can apply to your practical forestry knowledge and experience. Hi, Dr. Self. My name is Alice Blank, and I live in Blank County, Mississippi. I recently inherited 42 acres of trees. I don't like forest herbicides, and I want to know how to make money off of my inheritance. Can you help me, please? This is the type of questions that we get in extension forestry with more regularity than I would care to admit. That's a very, very, very hard question to answer without knowing something about your goals as a landowner, what you expect to get out of your property, what you have, where you're even starting off when you start talking about, an inheritance and what can you do with it. There's a whole lot of stuff to be unpacked in there that you didn't give a lot of information to us as professionals, that are here to help you along that venture.
Yeah, and listening to that email, I did kind of get a little bit of a laugh because we get these quite a bit. These are great emails to get, though, because we love helping landowners either, change the direction of their land ownership to meet their goals and objectives, or to get them started. I mean, this is the fun part of the job for us. But just some definitional things we gotta do first, right? You'll hear these terms, goals and objectives. These goals are achievable outcomes, right, that we're looking to have on this forested property, but they're broad, they're long in time, the time scale. So we would think of the entire life of the stand as we're trying to achieve a goal over that period. With our objectives, these are shorter terms things, and we're going to be able to define them with measurable action that helps us achieve those goals. And the email that Dr. Self just read to the audience, there's a conflict. Her goals and her objectives are not going to match.
Sure. She
wants to maximize monetary gain, but she doesn't want to have any herbicides. And both from an economic and biological perspective that we can either talk about in this episode or in the future, that's going to be difficult on both of those margins. And that's how he and I are approaching this. I'm more of the business econ side. He's more of the biology and silviculture side. But those two intersperse, and they come together to let you know realistically, given your goals and objectives, what's realistic for your property.
Sure, and I mean, there's a lot packed in Alice's question. There's a lot packed in your response there too, Sean. But that's one of the things that, at least from my perspective, people don't realize, and they don't really. They just don't understand when they're going into a lot of the forest management scenarios that we see out there, where there are commonly accepted practices that we utilize in forestry, like herbicides for site prep and some of the intermediate treatments and things like that. They don't realize even that that's necessarily almost a given in that type of management. Obviously, you don't have to do that type of thing, but typically that's going to be just an expected use in anything we do from a forest management standpoint. So they don't realize that it's almost a necessity in layman's terms, I guess. And because of that, they have some preconceived notion for it. Doesn't have to be necessarily herbicides. It can be burning, or it can be cutting trees or whatever. They don't realize that that's a not just like I said, an accepted practice, but almost a necessity in your management efforts as you move down through your rotation of your stand. And by not understanding that and not knowing that, they have unreal expectations. They have unreal goals for that they move forward with. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to, try to help people reason through what's possible, and it's fine. In Alice's case, if she doesn't want to use herbicides, there's absolutely some things we can do. But just exactly like you said, you're not going to optimize. You're not going to be able to, from a biological / economic standpoint, be able to maximize your dollars on that particular property. That's fine, but those goals of ownership need to reflect a realization that that's not something that's going to be on the plate, so to speak, as they go down the road.
That's right. Your goals and your objectives have to align with one another in order for these long-term outcomes to occur. And as we'll talk about in our next episode on a management plan, objectives and goals can change for any number of reasons, either internal or external to your own decision making. But we do want to caution the landowner and to say that, you will get consultants or specialists, extension specialists like Dr. Self or me, or others, maybe working at the Forestry Commission, and they have a certain way that they look at doing land management, and that may not always align with your goals and objectives. And so while we just gave you the one extreme, the other extreme should always be, this is your property, you're in charge of these things, and while we're here to make sure that you understand the trade-offs and the actual possibilities, you want to direct your own ship, and you don't want somebody else telling you, that this is what you ought to do. And so I don't have the email pulled up here, but I've been approached in the past from a landowner who told me they wanted what they wanted. It was a very wildlife oriented, bird watching, things like that. And the consultant who was helping them gave them a very strict kind of pine the pine rose sort of approach to forestry, which is fine, because if you're trying to maximize economic returns, that's what you would do. But it's not necessarily what you would do for what they wanted, which was more of a bird watching, more of a natural flush understory of tree, of vegetation and things like that for bugs, which would then attract birds, etc. Those two can both be goals that you have for a property, but again, there's trade-offs. So you can have some wildlife-oriented things, you can have some economic-oriented things, but again, you can't maximize both of them, right? There's trade-offs that are always going on whenever you're making these decisions. So again, just want to clarify for you, right, that you have your goals and objectives. It's not the consultant or our role to tell you that's the wrong objective. It's our role to show you what's possible within that framework, within those objectives and those outcomes.
Absolutely. That's kind of, if you go back to silviculture 101, whatever the actual number of the course is, but that's one of the very, the strongest tenets of silviculture. Yes, it's applied ecology, it's biological in nature, but number one on the list is goals of ownership. And it is not our job as professionals to try to impose our goals or our way of thinking of what's important onto you as a landowner. It's our job to give you the options, give you the alternatives to manage your property in the way that you see as important. Now, obviously, if it's impossible, it's not going to happen. We can't in good consciousness actually tell you, well, let's go down that road. And that leads into kind of an example that I use with species site suitabilities in hardwoods. Very, very, very important that you match your species to the appropriate sites. Pines, not as big of an issue. Hardwoods, it becomes very, very site specific, depending on the species. Something like nuttall oak, if you go into the bottoms, isn't a big deal. You can plant it on a pretty wide range of sites. Something like cherry bark oak, that is absolutely very, very, very top list kind of concern when you're doing any kind of planting or even management, if you get right down into it, of an existing stand. And the example that always comes to mind is had a landowner several years back that wanted to. You called me up and had 60 some odd acres and in Webster County, Mississippi, and wanted to plant cherry bark oak, black walnut, and Royal Paulownia on red clay hills. Well, not going to work, folks. That's just not a possibility. It's not something that we can biologically achieve. So your goal as a landowner isn't really feasible if you get into that scenario. And our job as a professional is to not lead you down that bunny trail, not let you make those mistakes. And a forester, a consultant, wildlife biologist worth their salt, they're not going to let you do that. But that's our job. That's our job. That's our goal. Our goal, as a professional, is to try to guide you in that right direction, not to impose what we think will make us the most amount of money in any venture. So.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned those biological limitations, because the same thing's true from an economic perspective. I remember you called me, I don't know, a few weeks ago and said, "Hey, sure. Give me a quick workup on the cost of establishment for planting." I think it was cherry bark oak, and the time horizon you'd need to get that back versus pine, and it was just double the time, double the cost. And so somebody who's looking to maximize income, right? They would need to be very careful at the beginning about the costs that they're going to incur, because this is going to be a long-term project. And so you can get faked out pretty easily with costs occurring now versus revenues occurring later. There's some calculations that would have to be done to back all that stuff up to present time to be able to determine, is this going to be a profitable venture? Now, some of you may not care about the profitability, and in that case, the money is not the issue. You want a specific wildlife or some sort of natural outcome, which, you can spend more on that and don't have to worry about the profitability, but there are still some limitations. You probably don't want to go too far into pocket for them. So there's ways to get to those objectives that you want that are feasible biologically, that are feasible economically, and that's going to be the role of the professionals to help you with. The main thing to remember, right, is from that economic perspective. I had a gentleman, he and his wife, we sat down at my office for about an hour and a half, and after we were done, they were so elated. They were like, "Well, who do we make the check out to?" I said, "Well, the state's already covering that. There's no check to make out," and they loved that. But it was fun to talk with him. But he was set on getting a tractor for the property, and I said, "Well, you got 40 acres, and you're talking of the piece of equipment he was talking about was pretty expensive, and if you start doing the cash flow analysis on it, they also wanted to be listed as a business. That means you have to be profitable, and it's going to be hard to be profitable on that." Low site productivity pine stand, with a $500,000 to $1 million piece of equipment cost right up front, that's basically acting as an anchor for the next 30 to 35 years. And so again, it's all about what's feasible given what you want to do. I just wanted to do a real quick look here. This is from the National Woodland Owner Survey, and they don't do this survey every year, but about every 5 years. And I always find interesting to look at that. We'll talk about the top 5 reasons for owning, right? Today we're going over goals and objectives. So, what you would want to do as a landowner. So what are the things that landowners own timber for? Interestingly enough, while economics is important, it's not always at the top of the list. I mean, we can see here the top 5 reasons: family legacy, beauty and scenery, wildlife habitat, privacy, land investment. But you don't see timber income in that top 5 reasons. And it usually isn't, no matter which state you go to, it's not in the top 5. It's probably on everybody's list somewhere, but it's never at the top of the list. And so a lot of times what the income's there to do is just to help you facilitate these other things that you want to do on your property.
Absolutely. That's how I describe forestry in the Delta region. Pretty much anytime I'm dealing with it, it's not necessarily that the people that own property own forest land over there are concerned with trees. A lot other than a place to hunt. A lot of people don't really care about the trees. So for me to do forestry in the Delta, that's how I have to couch it. I have to couch it as, well, here's you an income stream to be able to pay for the wildlife habitat improvements and things like that you want. And it works. You get a lot of people that are definitely interested in management of those forests for that particular purpose. They don't mind the trees, but they're not necessarily looking at them as their end goal. Again, it's hunting, it's recreation. The other kind of people that I run into with some regularity over there are those that had that opinion to begin with. And then they get, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years down the road, and all of a sudden they want to send their grandkid to college or something. And at that point, that timber investment becomes a timber investment, not a wildlife investment.
That's right. Yep.
And they become real interested at that point in having something that they can liquidate and actually bring in some income to send little Johnny off to college with.
Sure.
So those goals absolutely can shift over time as you go down through your management and your ownership of that particular stand.
And you want to be careful, right, with regards to that there are things we can do. Timber stands are great because they can accomplish a bunch of objectives and satisfy a lot of goals simultaneously, again, with trade-offs. But if you get too far down one path, there's things we can do to remediate that stand, to shift it into another direction, right? But again, there's limitations. If you've had an understocked stand for 30 years and now all of a sudden you want to go cut timber, you're just not going to get much, per acre, unless maybe you just get, time the market just lucky or just have a really great species. But it's the big ifs, right? Those are very big ifs. So you want to be mindful. Could my objectives change over time? What might that look like? And maybe try to keep yourself in a little bit of a middle ground, where you're not sacrificing one thing versus the other, so that you can shift in a particular direction, 15, 20 years down the road.
Sure.
The last thing I want to mention before we finish up here, there are tax implications as well. So the way that you define your goals and objectives on your property are a signal to the IRS whether or not profit on the property is your main objective, your primary objective. And if it's not, you can't classify as a business. And if you can't classify as a business, there's a lot of the deductions and things like that you're not going to be able to receive if you're classified as an investor or as what we would call a hobbyist or personal landowner. So you could still own 40 acres for quote unquote personal reasons or non-profit motivated reasons. And we'll talk about that more in subsequent podcasts. But you do need to keep the fact that you're going to have to give Uncle Sam something when you're putting all this together. Because the way you define your goals and objectives, which then will, as we'll talk about in this next episode, will kind of be the starting point for your management plan, right? Those have implications biologically, economically, and then tax, from a tax standpoint at some case. Maybe not right away, but certainly 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Those income taxes eventually come due if you start cutting trees.
Sure. All great points, and that's one of the things. And I don't know the answer to this. I should know this, but I don't. So I'm going to ask you this question. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's some tax bracket differences between the ownership classes. Correct? Like difference between a business and a hobby farm, as far as the amount of tax that can be charged back, as far as capital gain and things like that.
Actually, on capital gains, that's the one category where all three groups would satisfy. Now, to get long-term capital gains, there's different rules depending on how you receive the property.
Okay,
but that's only part of the story. It's a big part. But deductions and reforestation tax credits and cost shares and all these other things, those a lot of times are a function of that ownership objective, and that can be that can make or break the profitability of a particular stand or forest that you might own. So it's still something to keep in mind, most certainly.
Okay.
Well, with that, we're going to finish up this episode on goals and objectives, and we look forward to hearing feedback from the landowners and others that are listening in. We'd like to make this an interactive podcast as much as we can, and so please, feel free to reach out to us if there's anecdotes on this subject that you'd like us to consider or mention in upcoming episodes as we're putting together future topics. We'd love to hear from you, and until then, everybody take care and happy managing.
Absolutely, we appreciate you listening in. The Timber University podcast has been brought to you by Mississippi State University Extension Forestry.
If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email us at timberuniversity, one word, @gmail.com.